The license plates in Washington, D.C., well, this won't be news for anyone who's been there, are a tad bit ridiculous. They have the Washington city flag, which is beautiful, juxtaposed with a phrase. At first, it seems like the classic phrase from the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, but then you realize that the DC license plates have dropped the no. It just says taxation without representation. And when I first saw it, I sort of squinted and assumed it was a typo, which is, I think, a lot of people's reactions not just to the license plate issue, but to almost all of DC politics. But alas, it is not a typo. It is a form of symbolic protest first lodged by a former mayor of Washington in the 70s, to protest the fact that his district is, to this day, run by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States, a collection of delegates and elected officials from everywhere in America but Washington, D.C. They pass the municipal laws, governance, zoning, everything for DC, and although the mayor's office still has some sway, it is primarily a district run specifically by the House and Senate, which is patently ridiculous. While they're not too busy running the district, even representatives on the nation's capital have noticed this and have begun to push for DC to become its own self-regulating body. Which poses the question, should Washington, D.C. be granted statehood? And the answer is, emphatically, yes. Washington is an outdated political arrangement that disenfranchises millions. It's time for that to end. This is for three main reasons. First, the political arrangement that got Washington this way, as a district instead of a state, is now outdated and irrelevant. Has been since the 1900s. Second, the suppression of the vote in DC and suppression of political participation in the city at large is heavily steeped in a dark history of institutional racism. And third, allowing the district to own its own laws and become a sovereign, self-regulating body is just common sense to any American with an understanding of their government. It's really that simple. But first, the original purpose for keeping Washington a district should be familiar to you if you're aware of early American history or have seen Hamilton. Obviously, what happened is that Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, to pass his national debt plan, needed Southern votes for it in the House. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, then influential Southerners, promised to get in the votes if he would sell New York City out as then capital of the nation, which rotated between several cities, but primarily New York and Philadelphia, and establish a new capital on an unpopulated swamp on the Potomac River, which was sort of seen as the dividing line between North and South. Sectional politics were extremely important in early America, obviously up to the Civil War, and so situating the capital between North and South was seen as a paramount priority to Southerners. Indeed, that's what happened, and French architecture Charles L'Enfant was hired to design the street plan. Indeed, he did, and that's why DC has such an odd shape and such a perfect grid system, and hence was the beginning of a city that would eventually come to encompass millions and be the third largest combined statistical area in the United States. The Wall Street Journal in 2018 reported, quote, DC was created as an antebellum olive branch. It's pointless now. And that's entirely true. The district was originally a peace offering to Southerners who felt embattled by Northern political dominance, and that's not too important anymore, obviously. The South has no secessionist motives, and DC is primarily surrounded by states that vote the same as it, so granting it extra political power wouldn't be any specific attack on any specific region. The history of DC's lack of statehood shows clearly that since the Civil War, the idea of DC as a district is an outdated and unnecessary claim towards tradition that has no real rooting in modern political reality. But second, the suppression of civic participation in DC is heavily rooted in institutional racism, as reported on by Vice in 2016. Quote, "The dark history of voter suppression in the nation's capital runs deep." That's entirely true. DC is one of the more minoritized, poorer cities in the country, and that fact has made it a heavy target for segregationists in the 60s, as what would happen if Northerners and Yankees were allowed to get away with passing anti-segregation legislation, and more recently it's become a dog whistle of everything that's wrong with America's cities. This is deeply rooted in a history of particularly anti-black voter suppression laws that, although ended in practice, still survive in theory, particularly in the fact that DC doesn't get to vote for their own senators or House of Representative members. This is obviously steeped in a dark past, as Vox in 2018 reports, quote, "Republican hesitance towards DC statehood seems vague to most, but district residents have seen this all before." And that's entirely true. Since the turn of the century, DC has been scapegoated for being too minoritized, too poor, and housing too many people of color, and it's been denied systemic civic participation because of that fact for decades, almost a century now. That needs to end, and in an era when America is confronting its dark racist past in many ways, DC statehood is an important step in the right direction. But third, allowing the district to become its own sovereign, self-regulating body, a state, is just common sense. DC is more populated than many states in the nation, so it's not a population issue, otherwise we'd be denying sovereignty to Rhode Island and Wyoming. The New York Times on March 13th reports, quote, "Why is DC statehood controversial? Primarily because of two reasons. One, tradition, and B, a dark history of racist voter suppression, which we've already covered. But those points are irrelevant. So doesn't it seem common sense that DC would be able to pass its own tax laws, sales taxes, fund itself, and create municipal services for its residents that don't just fall under the banner of the DC city?" That's a great point, and the Washington Post on March 15th reiterates it, saying that, quote, "DC statehood is a long overdue proposal. It's simply common sense. The idea that a district with millions of people should be run by delegates from all across the nation except the place where people are living to be run within it is patently ridiculous, and the idea that we continue this resolution is a long overdue statement of tradition and hesitancy built around racist voter suppression laws." So, for these three reasons, first, that the original purpose for keeping Washington as a state is now outdated and irrelevant thanks to the end of the Civil War and the large end of sectional politics in the United States. Second, that suppression of civic participation, particularly voting rights in DC, is heavily rooted in institutional racism and prejudice. And third, that allowing the district to be its own state and sovereignly run itself, sovereignly tax itself, sovereignly decide its own municipal legislation is just common sense. DC is sadly very used to being marginalized, and it's time for that to end. Because taxation without representation in the nation's capital, doesn't that seem a little un-American? Thank you.